It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Adam Blai, and we're going to be discussing his new book, The History of Exorcism. Adam, it's always a joy to speak with you. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks, Shaun. It's good to be back.
Always a pleasure to speak with you. I think this is your third or fourth time on the show. We've gone at length over your origin story in the past, but I know somebody's going to listen to this or watch this. This is going to be their very first time meeting you. So give us that elevator pitch version of the Adam Blai origin story. If this is their first time connecting with you, tell them how you got involved in the very unique kind of work that you do.
Okay, so I'm a lay person. I'm not a priest. I'm not ordained, but I'm a church-appointed, real official expert on exorcism in the Catholic Church. I help train priests in exorcism nationally in the United States and internationally to some extent now, and recently a lot in the Far East. Been involved in this for about 15 years. Got pulled in through starting with brain science, brainwave research, and interested in kind of hallucinations and altered states in completely healthy people that you can induce through hypnosis, which, don't play around with hypnosis. And then, got drawn into this over the years. And so I work full time for the church, do a few different things, but one of them is evaluating cases of, claims of demonic problems in homes and possession. I've also investigated some miracles for the diocese, but that's very rare. And then writing some books. So, the book that I guess we're going to talk about, the goal of all these is to make a very approachable, easy read for people to get, a proper Catholic understanding of these things, as opposed to like a sensational version of it. That's kind of what I'm trying to do.
And I think the last book we talked about was the Exorcism Files, which a lot of it is very story driven, telling about situations and things that have happened. This is more of a history of exorcism, kind of throughout biblical church history, if you will. It's a kind of a broad scope. In terms of the market for exorcism related books, what's the important need or important hole that this book actually fills?
Well, I don't really think about that when I write books. Luckily, my publisher is pretty open to whatever I want to write about. And I don't worry about whether there's a need in the market. It's just whatever I'm interested in writing. In this case, I did a thesis in canon law as part of a kind of advanced degree program in canon law that I'm involved in. And I did it on the canonical history of exorcism, so how canon law developed. But through that, I found that the story of how exorcism came about, how it's done in different parts of the ancient Near East, where the Jews were, it actually was a really fascinating story, and I found it to be interesting. And I also thought that some people that are interested in exorcism, because it's such a popular kind of trope in movies and TV shows, podcasts. I have exorcist friends that give interviews. People are really interested in it, but outside of the movies, they often don't really know what that means. Like everybody has this idea from the films that a priest comes in and there's a dramatic 10 minutes and it's over and the person's free. But they don't know where that ritual came from. They've heard some of those words in the movie The Exorcist. They've heard the power of Christ compels you and things like that. But it's actually a really interesting story about how all this came to be. From the thousands of years before Jesus and the other ancient cultures the Jews were bumping into, to the Jewish version of it, and then Jesus's version, which was radically different, and then how the church tried to reproduce that in a sense, and then tightened it up and put rules around it because they saw it was such a dangerous ministry. So I thought it was an interesting journey. I'm hoping that it's a readable, easy book so people can get a proper understanding of this versus the Hollywood version.
Yeah, I think the Kindle version that I had is about 125 pages, so something you can get through fairly quickly. And so for so much of my career, I've been a publishing guy or a pub. Goodness, what did I do? publicity guy, also a publishing guy at the same time. So I'm always like, man, what space does this fill in the market? And as a guy who's fairly well read in the exorcism space, I've not encountered anything quite like this. I'm curious from a research perspective. Did you have to go to any new or unique sources for this material, or is this just stuff you've kind of acquired, kind of this story, this history of exorcism, just with a lot of the other research you've done through the years?
Yeah, it's through other research, and then there was a number of really good papers and studies. One dissertation that was really helpful to me that I actually was a reader on for. So I was one of the signers for a friend's dissertation. That was helpful and opened me up to a bunch of sources through overseeing his dissertation. I got to look into a lot of sources. That was very helpful. A lot of stuff is piled up on the shelves. And then a lot of obscure references from talks over the years have helped. And then there is a little bit of scholarly work on this, a few documents, but they're not really that approachable for the average reader. They're either extremely long or extremely technical. And so you kind of have to dig through those to drill back to the primary sources. So yeah, it's a little bit of it being exposed a long time and a few people that I'm standing on their shoulders that, have done a lot of good work of digging into those and then showing me the nooks and crannies to go into to find them.
Well, I want to, before we get into kind of the timeline, I think this is how the rest of the conversation is going to unfold. But just the term exorcism, kind of the popular pop culture understanding versus maybe the church's understanding, or exorcism contrasted with deliverance. How do we often maybe misunderstand a term like exorcism, or what are the things we sometimes get wrong?
Well, when people use the word exorcism, they think of the movies, they think of a priest having a dialogue with a demon and a possessed person in some way. And then they might think of giving commands. And really the essential difference between all other types of prayer and exorcism is that there's a command. So if I were to say to you, Shaun, it'd be great to have a cup of coffee if we were together in a room. And I would ask you that. That would be a request, a petition, right? But if I were to order you, Shaun, get up and get me a cup of coffee right now, you see, that feels very different. And it immediately causes a nervous laughter because it's a confrontation has just happened. So even amongst people, we're talking hypothetically, it creates a nervous stress reaction because we're now in conflict because I've given a command. So deliverance is essentially asking God to free a person of a spiritual problem, a demon, a deceptive evil spirit. And exorcism is essentially giving a command to that spirit. So in the name of Jesus, get out. That is qualitatively very different. And it's different for a couple reasons. Number one, it's a command. So that's different. Number two, it opens you up to a spiritual struggle with that being. So again, if I were to order you to get a cup of coffee for me, I would be consenting to you being like, dude, like I'm not your servant, I'd be opening myself up to a retort because I've done that. So take it further. People in a bar, somebody goes up and shoves somebody. They've opened themselves up to being shoved back. They can't say, I'm surprised I got shoved back when I went up and just started lipping off to somebody and pushed them in a bar. Take it, a step further, a step further. You're consenting to a struggle. And that's why the idea of authority is so important in this work, because if a person is going to consent to a struggle with a demon by giving it an order, they need some authority behind them that's going to compel the demon to obey the command, but also is going to protect them from the pushback, right? And that protection, in my experience, comes directly from God, who limits their activity because he's appointed you to be doing this work. So that these are a number of the reasons why, the armchair person who's not kind of supposed to be involved in this, and that's a tough thing to define, but essentially if you're not called to legitimate ministry by God, you're challenging a fallen angel to a struggle as a human being. And until, God willing, we all make it to heaven, we're going to be in a different state that's higher than we are now. But right now, we're in a lower state than even the fallen angels. So you're kind of challenging a gorilla to wrestle with you spiritually. That's not something you want to do without proper authority and backing you up. Another way to think about it, Shaun, and I know I'm talking a long time, is let's say you're on the street and you see somebody steal a purse from a lady, and you know the law about citizen's arrest. And you, as a regular citizen, just go up and tackle the guy and restrain him and call the police and then try to hold him until the police arrived. And you say citizen's arrest or whatever you're doing. And I don't even know if citizen's arrest is still legal, but the concept most people get or have heard that term. That's an attempt to subdue and confront a criminal as a citizen with no formal backup versus a police officer sees somebody steal the purse. He not only has the legal authority to give an order, to pull a gun, to wrestle the person legally, to use force to subdue them, but he has the entire police force, local, state, and federal, backing him up if he needs it. And that's the difference between a priest with permission from their bishop with the full backup of the church in heaven and the authority to do it versus the average citizen trying to do the citizen's arrest on a potentially armed criminal.
And one more thread I want to pull in kind of before we get to the timeline. And this was just something intriguing I wrote down from the introduction. And this is a quote. The church has allowed exorcism to flourish during periods of internal division and when an outside spiritual enemy is feared. I'm not going to say I completely understood what you meant by that. I was like, that's kind of an interesting. Like, what was the thought behind that? It's just I'd never thought of trying to understand exorcism from that vantage point.
Well, it's something you see when you look at the scope of the history of the church. Times where the church has talked a lot about exorcism and it's been an accepted part of the church's life is times when there's threats to the church. So, for instance, during the beginning of the Protestant movement, when Martin Luther made his complaints and there was a schism and the Protestant churches started splitting off, exorcism was actually one of the things that was used as a litmus test of which is the valid church. Is it the Catholic Church, the trunk of the tree, or is it the branch that split off from the tree, so many centuries after the church started? And exorcism was actually used as a proof of that. So they would have dueling exorcisms in some cases that were famous and promoted and written about situations because it was thought that the favor of God would only be with the true church. Another example is Freemasonry, which within 20 years of its beginning in the early 1700s, within 20 years, the popes were saying it was the greatest enemy of the church in the world. And Pope Leo XIII wrote the Minor Exorcism in 1890 specifically to curtail the activity of Freemasonry in the world, which was an external threat on the church that was not only societal but regarded as spiritual. So these are just two examples of this. The third one is kind of an obvious one, and that is in the very beginning of the church, in the first few hundred years, there was tremendous persecution by Rome. The church was not stable and flourishing and accepted. It was a marginalized and persecuted splinter group. And during those times, the idea of exorcism was active. If we look in the Acts of the Apostles, the idea of exorcism was a normal part of life.
I never thought of that idea of dueling exorcists. I guess I'm thinking like the Lutheran pastor and the Catholic priest walk into an exorcist. We'll see who's up to the task or something like that.
Yeah, and there were situations where they literally alternated week to week, and they allowed the people to come and watch and judge for themselves who had the proper authority.
But I guess from a public versus private, I mean, like historically, did you see a lot more public displays of exorcism versus now it seems to be rather private?
Yeah, there was periods where it was more public. The one we just talked about. And in the early centuries, it wasn't this regulated fixed ritual where there was a fixed book that you used and there was rules and there was a list of instructions at the beginning of the book. It was kind of a free for all. Every region of the world developed their own idea of exorcism and how to do it, and what readings and prayers would be used. And they also varied in how public or private these things were. In general, over time, it became more and more private, not to hide something from people, but to protect the dignity and the privacy of the people that were being prayed with. Like if you imagine your mother or your sister being possessed and then them allowing reporters to film the exorcisms, that would be a horrible violation of the family's privacy, leading to all kinds of problems for those people's lives. And so the church has been really careful to protect people's privacy over time. So yes, right now it's always a very private ministry.
Well, let's jump into the first part of the book. You start out with exorcism before Jesus. Talk to us a little bit about the A&E, the ancient Near Eastern perspective on exorcism. I'm thinking a lot of the audience has never read any material that even has talked about exorcism or kind of that worldview that would be involved in that time of history.
Yeah, well, one thing about that time in history is most ailments, whether they were mental illness or physical problems, were regarded as being caused by a spirit. So medicine was really primitive, psychology really wasn't developed. And so they kind of ascribed things to spirits. So if you had a bad headache that was intractable, they would do a ritual to drive away the spirit that was causing that headache. And this is something that you could see if you study different cultures around the world as civilizations move through kind of animism in the early state, where the basic primitive human religion is there's spirit behind everything in life. Literally, everything has a spirit, and you can see echoes of this still in certain religions around the world. And then it moves to polytheism, where there's gods that are more detached from nature and kind of outside of nature, but there's a bunch of them. And then ultimately it moves to monotheism. And that's kind of the sequence that civilizations go through throughout human history around the world. So in the ancient Near East, it was more of that first version where there's spirit behind everything, good and bad. So, you pray for rain. You do rituals to appease the gods that are behind the harvest being good, because that's literally determines whether you're going to be alive next year. And so, you want to keep your idea of the spirits behind the rain, you want to keep them happy so that you stay alive. And then for negative things like floods, earthquakes, things like that, you do things to appease those gods so that they don't get angry and unleash problems on you. So that was kind of the worldview in the ancient world was very spiritual in that sense. But when it came to people that seemed to have spirits literally in them, speaking through them and causing really extraordinary problems, way beyond headaches and epilepsy and mental illness, everybody had different approaches to try to deal with that. And a lot of them were based more on what we would call magic. So the idea that certain objects are effective against spirits, like a modern version of it, everybody's heard of basically, is the idea of saging your house when you think you have a bad spirit in your house, right? A lot of people think that for whatever vague Native American idea behind this, that sage, by its very nature, just that plant for some reason, when it's dried and burned, drives away evil spirits. This is very similar to what you would have seen in the ancient world 3 or 5,000 years ago, where, and there's echoes of this in the Bible. There's a reference to burning the liver of a particular fish, and that the smoke from that liver burning drove away a spirit, a demon. And that's actually in the Old Testament. It's not specified what fish that is, but this idea was around. So the other big theme, okay. So first off, you would have certain things in nature that they thought affected spirits. Then you would have magical incantations, which were often gibberish. Like if you actually got things translated, they would kind of be gibberish. Think of the word abracadabra that we're all familiar with, right? Abracadabra is a word that's gibberish, basically, but we all associate it with something magic happens when that word is used, right? And stage magicians use it. And this, I'm sharing that because there's echoes of these ideas still in our modern culture, even though we don't necessarily think of them that way. Okay, so incantations, amulets, you know, imprinting some letter or word on something and then wearing it was considered powerful. Rings were considered powerful. And then doing an incantation over a person, often gibberish, was considered powerful. And then what started to develop more for the Jews was the idea not so much of relying on these objects or incantations or kind of weird, baseless rituals. They started to rely on holy people. And so it was really common for the Jews to invoke, say, the name of Solomon and say to a spirit, in the name of Solomon, get out of this person. Because they're basically saying, I'm not necessarily holy enough to tell you to leave, and I wouldn't dare to, because from the Jewish viewpoint, and this is critical, from their viewpoint, only God can command a spirit to go, and it'll go. Like literally, only God has that. And so they would invoke a name of, say, Solomon. They're not saying that Solomon has that power, but they're saying he was so holy and close to God that by invoking his name, that'll strike fear into the spirit and it will leave. So that was kind of what was going on. And it's important to also get that exorcism was a common practice at the time of Jesus. It had been around for centuries or millennia. Jews were familiar with it. There was rabbis that did exorcisms. If anybody's watched the TV show The Chosen, very popular kind of retelling of the Gospels focused on the apostles, literally episode 1 of the entire series shows a rabbi doing an exorcism by reading the Torah, essentially. So in that case, it was just reading the word of God was regarded. Once they had the Torah, the idea that the word of God is kind of, in a sense, it's a living emanation of God. And we think about the Gospels that way to a certain extent. The word in the Gospels, the word writ big, is kind of God in a very real sense because it's God speaking. And so as the Jews came along, they started invoking holy people. And then as the Torah was developed, they would then read the Torah because they had an understanding this is a way to directly connect with God when we read the Torah. So these were kind of all the things that were floating around. And in addition to that, there was kind of different versions of that in different cultures because the Jews weren't the only people, right? Canaanites famously they were polytheists and they had a lot of that stuff, but then they added layers of really dark stuff like child sacrifice as a way to get power and appease the gods. And you see echoes of this in black magic today. So there's a whole lot going on, but that gives you a general picture.
And I want to get to kind of how Jesus changes, like what Jesus does with exorcism, how that's a shift from what the Jewish people that were contemporary to him were doing. But first, I'd love to hear a little bit about that intertestamental period, like what was going on in that kind of gap between the Old Testament and New Testament, and related to that, like what were the sources you consulted to kind of compile kind of what was going on worldview wise, exorcism wise in that time period.
Well, there's relatively few sources in terms of what has survived in terms of a primary source. So there's certain artifacts and tablets that have survived that seem to have exorcistic prayers on them. There's some that are Sumerian that are in the what they call chicken scratch on the clay cylinders, basically a little stick to push into wet clay and let it dry, and it becomes a cylinder that you can roll across something, and it'll make a straight kind of line of say 5 lines of a book all at once by rolling that cylinder, and it tells a story briefly. There's Sumerian incantations. Um, there's just straight historical meaning, like if you dig into not so much religious history, but just straight academic history. So people that are, say, classics professors that study ancient languages and ancient cultures, there will be subsets of that where they study the idea of exorcism and how it was done, and they will get the actual things like parallel would be think of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So digging up the actual primary source and translating that, and then giving those translations to people like me who can't read Sanskrit or the other languages are floating around in the ancient world, giving those translations directly to the researcher. So it's basically just hardcore academic journals, not so much religious or spiritual, just straight academic work on ancient cultures, and then digging within that and finding the little piece of that that's related to exorcism. It's usually not a huge amount of information, but it is enough to start to piece it together.
And fast forward now back to Jesus's time. In terms of how Jesus approaches exorcism, to say how his contemporaries were approaching it, is he controversial or is he surprising people? Like what was unique about how Jesus approached this topic?
Yeah, so if you go back to the story of the synagogue in Capernaum, it's kind of the first big event that leads to his fame. It was Sabbath, so it was Saturday. They were reading the Torah, um, hanging out in the synagogue. Whoever was reading that day was reading. It doesn't really tell us those details, but Jesus is there, and somebody falls on the floor in the corner and starts growling and rolling around and says, "We know who you are, Jesus," and he says, "Be quiet, come out of him." And the radical thing that the Jews responded to wasn't that somebody was possessed. They were used to that. They had seen that. That's not that big of a deal. Um, and it wasn't that a rabbi or a teacher cast it out. That also was not a big deal, but it was the way he did it. So going back to the beginning of our conversation, the idea of authority. So from the Jewish worldview at the time, and still today, I believe, you'd have to check depending on the rabbi and the sect of Judaism, only God can just cast a demon out. Only God has dominion over spirits directly, where God can just arbitrarily do whatever he wants. Everybody go here, you go over there, sit there for 1,000 years, whatever he wants, he can do because he's God. And so the Jews weren't used to people not invoking somebody. They were used to people either invoking Elijah, invoking Solomon's name, invoking names that were considered powerful and holy to scare the spirits, or reading the Torah, reading the Word of God. But nobody was just simply saying, "Get out of him." And when he did that, that's what was shocking. It was the way he did it. He didn't rely on anybody else's authority. He relied only on his own authority. It was just his word. That was the shocking thing. And so people said, like, how can this be? No man has that power. No man has that authority. This cannot be. And that's why one of the retorts a little bit later in the Gospels, they come to him and they say, it's by you are in league with a demon. It's by Beelzebub that you're casting demons out. So basically, you have a bigger demon in you than the demons you're casting out. And that's how you're getting this apparent power and authority. And that leads to his retort, then Satan's kingdom is divided against itself and it would fall. So yeah, that was the radical thing, and that led to the buzz. That was the first big thing that led to the buzz, because he did it in a synagogue, which was public, and it was before people that would have had the ability to write things down and send letters and spread the word about it. The Cana miracle with the wine wasn't so much done publicly. A few people knew that in the back room he had done this, but it wasn't like touted to everybody. It was told later amongst the few people that were privy to what went on, but the synagogue event was done publicly in front of officials. There was some type of local rabbi that was in charge that would have sent letters probably to Jerusalem, like, this guy's doing crazy stuff. We need to investigate him. So yeah, it was a qualitatively different thing. And he went on to do the same thing every time he dealt with demons, and he did it publicly.
And in terms of that kind of commissioning the church, kind of handing off, empowering the apostles to move forward with kind of exorcism after Jesus leaves the scene, so
Hmm.
to speak, I guess, how do we transition that from the ministry of Jesus to more broadly the ministry of the apostles, ministry of the church?
Well, I mean, he literally said, "I give you authority over, snakes and scorpions." There's a reference to two different kind of classes of demons. Um, and he literally gave them the same authority that he had demonstrated that he had in himself to his church. And then he ordered them to go cast out demons, heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out demons. So he not only gave the church that authority, but he ordered them to go do it. Just a, I don't know, maybe interesting side note. Just, I think 3 weeks ago, we were in sessions. I attend exorcisms every week, and there was one of the spirits made an offhand comment. We weren't talking with it. Sometimes they just prattle on themselves without being, you're not interacting with them. They like to talk. And it kind of said in an amusing way, like thinking to itself, wasn't it nice in the time before when humans had authority? And it was kind of wistfully saying, I'm stuck in this chair in this church, with these human beings having the authority to boss me around. Wasn't it nice before the time when humans had authority?
Wow, that's fascinating to think that a demon would long back for that time before authority was at work in the church. I'm not going to get into every single time period that Adam
Mhm.
covers in the book. You want to get all the meaty details, you're going to have to pick up the book. It's a fast read, but I think definitely worth your time. Kind of time after after the apostles, you go through period of the Roman persecution, early Church of the West, Middle Ages, and kind of anything from those three stages that particularly stands out or that you find the most interesting.
Well, it was a bit of the Wild West for a number of centuries. I found that to be pretty fascinating. So, and what came out of that, and there's a few books that kind of try to explore these questions. So, one of them is this one. It's "Believe Not Every Spirit," uh,
We can
which
see
is,
it well enough there. Yeah.
yeah, there's a few books like this where the idea of discerning between possession, mysticism, or just madness um, was a big question in the early centuries of the church and in the Middle Ages, because there was a growing understanding of medicine and psychology, and there was these demons pretending to be all kinds of different things, including God or saints or holy angels in people, and giving supposed prophetic messages, giving new revelations, doing what seemed to be miracles and tricking people into following them. And then there was demons acting like typical demons. And then there was genuine mysticism, where there were saints that were going into mystical states and having a brush with God that was so close that they were also performing miracles themselves that were genuine miracles. Now, God's doing the miracle, right? Theologically, we understand that God's doing the miracle. The human doesn't have that power, but they're so cabled into God and so close to God that God's power is working through them and moving into the world through them. So during this time of the kind of Wild West in exorcism, there was just really holy people that were usually ascetics. These are like the people that go out and live in a cave for years, alone, like St. Anthony of the Desert, kind of the first radical monastic. Um, and there was, people that lived in more regular monasteries or founded monasteries, like St. Benedict is an example. He did a number of exorcisms where essentially very holy people were able to do exorcisms not by reading a book or a rite, but just by reading scripture or just by touch. Just the contact with somebody that was so close with God was so jarring and terrifying to the demon that they would just leave the person that they were in. So, and one thing to note, by the way, is important, is that in all the history that I could find, there's never an example of a married lay person doing exorcisms. It is always essentially what we would call the religious, meaning somebody dedicated to a religious life. You're talking nuns, monks, priests were living in ascetic situations. It's never just the average lay person that's able to do exorcism. So in the early church, it wasn't necessarily priests with permission from their bishop at all. It was just whoever was holy and kind of bold enough to try it was doing it. And the people that were succeeding became famous because they were. And it led to cults of personality, which ended up being problematic. It also led to some people that were misdiagnosed, or people getting hurt. It led to a lot of train wrecks out of that Wild West. And some of the magical incantation approach crept back in that was there in the ancient world. And so some people were mixing that in with scriptural stuff. And so it got pretty out there. And that's why the church reined it all in over time, is that there was so many train wrecks and problems of it being unregulated that the church saw that there was a need to rein this in to make it safer and more helpful to people versus being kind of a sideshow.
And the Roman ritual of 1614, exorcism rite of 1614, I'm going to assume that's in response to something. Like what is that part of trying to rein everything in?
Yeah, it is. But yeah, so it's partly related to the Protestant Reformation. So there was a need to respond to the criticisms of the Protestant Reformation across all arenas within the church. So defending the theology of the church against various criticisms. And so there was a tightening up of documents. The effort was suddenly made to codify things into canon law more accurately and get universal in how the mass is said, get it global and universal in how confession is done and the theology of confession, baptism, and the background of that. So all these, ecumenical councils have been going on for a long time, but a lot of this was a response to the Protestant Reformation. So amongst all that, they wanted to standardize exorcism. And so they took basically the most experienced guy who had done a lot of exorcisms and learned from the best. And he was also a scholar. And he took the best books they had from around the world and combined it into one rite and combined the wisdom of all the notes that people had made over the centuries. You're talking, hundreds of human lifetimes worth of effort, and culling all that and putting it in one book. And so, because one of the potential areas of criticism was that it was the Wild West. And so for a Protestant, they could point and say, well, look, you're mixing magical rituals with this. And you say priests are so important, but look at this layperson over here. They're doing exorcisms and they're not a priest. It was so kind of varied that there was a lot of places to find fault. And so that was part of it. But I think also providentially, it was just good for the church to get all the wisdom of all the, lifetimes of experience together in one book, because the introductory instructions are just super helpful because they give you do's and don'ts. They give you warnings about the various things demons do. And that came from all those centuries of experience.
And the latter part of the book, you kind of get into exorcism in the 18th and 19th centuries. I think you'd mentioned Pope Leo the 13th is responding to Freemasonry being problematic for the church. What's kind of that progression we get in the latter part of the book as we kind of get the sort of different councils and different things that are kind of maybe tightening up exorcism, or what are is it a series of things the church is continuing to respond to over time?
Well, the 1614 rite worked really well, continues to work really well. A lot of people still use it. A lot of exorcists still use it. What's been going on recently, as you mentioned, Pope Leo the 13th wrote the minor exorcism, which was a whole new thing. It was originally to curb Freemasonry, but then as the threat of Freemasonry diminished, they still found it really helpful. And there's kind of a very watered down version of it, which is the St. Michael prayer. Most people have heard the St. Michael prayer or heard about it. And that really came from that minor exorcism. So as Freemasonry diminished as a threat, they started using it for house cases, for cursed objects, for people when you're not sure if they're possessed. You could do this, which isn't a solemn exorcism regulated by law, but it's agitating enough to the demon to force it to show itself so that you can test whether it's actually a possession. So it kind of became more generalized and useful in different ways. And then the most recent development is the new Rite of Exorcism, which originally was 1999, went through a whole bunch of revisions, 2017, there's an English translation finally officially available here in the States. And that's a brand new exorcism rite for people. So that's the solemn exorcism for possessed people. The minor exorcism, so it's a revamp of Leo's prayer, Leo the 13th's prayer for houses and objects. And then a third section, which is prayers for the faithful to say for themselves. So for the average layperson to say in kind of self-defense. So that book is not because the old rite was deficient or not working. It didn't really need revision, but Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, it required that every rite in the church be revised across the board. And so exorcism was kind of the last thing on the desk. And that's why it took from 1964 until 1999 to get the first preliminary version of it. And then it took many years of working on that and revising it to get to where we are today.
And if we kind of contrast that minor rite of exorcism, St. Michael's prayer, solemn exorcism, is that all relegated really to more of a priestly class, so to speak, or is some of that open to lay people? I know people are often confused about what they should or should not dabble in sometimes.
Yeah. So the solemn exorcism for people is absolutely 100% limited to priests with permission from their bishop. And if a priest tries it without permission from his bishop, the demon immediately calls him on it and says, "You don't have permission. You don't have authority over me. I'm not doing anything that you say." And it's not that the person's been told whether the priest has permission or not. The demon knows. And if he walks in the hall and calls the bishop, gets permission over the phone and walks back in, the demon immediately is obedient. Whether the priest verbalizes that, "Hey, I got permission," or not, they already know.
That's fascinating. Wow.
And I've seen that a number of times. So that one's super clear. Like, don't mess around with possessed people. Don't buy the book on Amazon and try to do this yourself. You're gonna become the next case, essentially. It's not good. This is not something to play around with. The minor exorcism also has a rubric, meaning a rule, that says it can only be said by a bishop or a priest with permission from their bishop. Now, online, a lot of times people remove the rule and they publish it online or on a phone app, and they encourage lay people to say it. But it actually is restricted by law. You can't do that unless you're a priest with permission from your bishop. Why? Because it includes a command, which we talked about at the top of our discussion, and why commands are qualitatively different than "Jesus, please help this person," that's deliverance. Some people would, some Protestants would say deliverance is giving commands. Deliverance that term is a broad umbrella. Like, deliverance is very vague. It just means being freed of a problem. But I'm saying operatively, the way people do deliverance, at least from in the Catholic world, is supplication, meaning a request to God, versus laying on hands and saying, "In the name of Jesus, get out." That's exorcistic prayer. It's what's called imprecatory prayer. It's a technical term, and that just means a command with a threat behind it. So if a cop says to you, "Get on the ground now," you know that there's a threat behind that, which is, if you don't do it, I'm going to pounce on you, right? So an imprecatory prayer is a command that has a threat behind it, which is get out or else. That God's going to make you suffer, to the demon. Okay, so, and then the final one, the St. Michael prayer, anybody can say. Just the regular St. Michael prayer. In fact, it was said at the end of every Mass in the world for decades. And it's still said in a number of places around the world. We say it in our diocese. Most priests have it said at the end of every Mass. And lay people can say that anytime they want.
Well, I think you and I have talked about this in one of our earlier interviews, but in terms of what we see on the paranormal and the ghost hunting shows and kind of the crazy smorgasbord, you have a lot of personalities on those shows, many of who I would say don't seem very Catholic necessarily, or Protestant, or anything to that effect, but they're often pulling on a broad selection of prayers, almost using them like incantations for protection, and this, that, and the other thing. From your perspective, how much confusion does that bring to people because people love those kinds of shows and watch them pretty regularly? It feels like a lot of your work is trying to set some of those bad ideas straight.
Yeah, and I've spent time in the world of, the paranormal interest, trying to warn people that essentially ghost hunting is necromancy, which technically means calling up the dead to talk to them. So basically asking the dead questions. Um, for a Christian, anybody that follows the Bible, necromancy is incredibly forbidden. God uses the word abhorrent about how God sees the practice of necromancy. Um, so it's a tremendous sin. It violates the first commandment. You're telling God, I don't trust you. I'm not going to wait on you. I want my answers from this spirit here, this created spirit floating around in this house, supposedly, on my terms when I want it. And I'm going to trust this spirit to give me my guidance. That's what you're doing. So you're breaking your friendship with God and starting a friendship with a deceptive spirit. And it's not going to be a dead person, because if you're dead and in heaven, you're not going to incite somebody into sin to pull them away from God. If you're in purgatory and you're on the way to heaven, you're on the slow escalator, you're going to get there eventually. He's not going to allow you to do it, and you're not going to want to do it because you're creating more sin. It doesn't make any sense. If you're damned, you're locked in hell. You're some demon's chew toy, essentially. I don't mean to make fun of it, but like you're not roaming around here. Like you're done. So what you have left is deceptive spirits running around pretending to be your dead grandma or your guardian angel, which the Bible warns us about. Like Paul says, the devil comes as an angel of light. He's a trickster, right? He's a liar. And so when you're ghost hunting, you're essentially talking to demons. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear once you've been involved in this for a while, and seen it all play out. So the paranormal TV shows, they're dangerous not only because they're promoting necromancy, but they're promoting these false ideas that you alluded to, which is you can be safe by, I don't know, imagining a white light around you, or burning sage and that'll keep you safe, or hold a cross up with no faith, true faith behind it, but that item is a talisman and there's power in the talisman. All these ideas, they're not based on relationship with God, and it's actual relationship with God that leads to you maybe being appointed by God to be involved in all this kind of extraordinary spiritual stuff, and leads to the protection and efficacy that can come. And you have to judge it by its fruits. If people are freed permanently and their lives are transformed in a positive way, then that's a good fruit. And it probably makes sense from a common sense standpoint to at least look into what the people are writing and saying that are involved in that, because just from a common sense standpoint, if it's working, there might be something to it.
And I guess to move towards wrapping up, let's touch on a few of the more contemporary decades. In terms of the 70s, you had the Exorcism film in 73, Annalise Michel in 76. Father Martin's book, Hostage to the Devil, came out in 76 as well. Just kind of, I guess, using those three, like, how were those some real cultural milestones in terms of like the conversation about and exorcism, work of the demonic, really coming front and center in culture in a way that we maybe hadn't seen in previous decades?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect it. The examples you gave there is Europe, in terms of Germany with Annalise Michel, and then the United States, because Father Martin was over here in New York City. I think it goes back to what we talked about at the top of our conversation, and that is you see exorcism become of interest in the church and in the world in times of trouble. So in the 70s, you're coming out of the 60s, which was a radical social change in the United States. And there was a revival of an interest in witchcraft that came about in the 60s with Gerald Gardner over in England, and the BBC airing interviews with him all over the world on the BBC TV network. That led to people saying, oh, witches actually exist. It's not just a vague fairy tale that doesn't exist anymore, which led to a rash of films in the 60s on the occult, films about Satanism and black masses and witches and all kinds of pagan, kind of ugly blood rituals and other things. There was a shocking amount of these movies in the 60s as a reaction to the revival and interest in the occult. And so I don't think it's any accident that the world then started showing interest in exorcism in the next decade, because the world now, as opposed to thinking of the church feeling like there's an external spiritual threat, the average person now suddenly felt like there's an external spiritual threat. Like, oh, there's Satanists and witches running around for the first time since the Middle Ages, and people are worshiping the devil, and it felt vaguely threatening. And so one of the solutions to that from the ancient world was, well, exorcism is a way to push back the darkness. And so I think just from a cultural standpoint, that might be why you see this flourish of interest in the 70s.
And I guess to draw a contrast between Father Martin's book Hostage to the Devil, and then you have Father Amorth's book An Exorcist tells his story. Martin's book is a bit more wild and crazy. I found that book way more disturbing personally than Amorth's book. Was Martin maybe embellishing a little bit? Like, it just seemed almost written in a way that was extremely shocking. Compared to Amorth's book, didn't bother me nearly as much.
I found Father Martin's book really disturbing also. Some of the imagery in there is just, it still sticks with me to this day. There's certain passages that I can still visualize immediately because they were so disturbing. There's clearly a sensational aspect to that. There's a bit of, painting a really lurid picture, which is going to sell a lot of books. And I'm not saying that he made it up, but I think he combined a bunch of different cases into one. And he also wasn't super clear between what was happening in the demonically influenced imagination and perception of people versus what was actually happening. So, some people might be imagining as they're reading that this horrific preternatural scene is actually playing out in flesh and blood in the room versus it's an experience happening in the mind of the possessed person. He wasn't super clear about that. I don't think it's terribly helpful, that kind of book, outside of scaring the crap out of people, and maybe they would stay away from playing around with demonic black magic because they might realize just how evil and hateful these things are, that they're not your friend. But for the average person, I think it just scares you. I don't think it leaves you with a whole lot. He kind of has an afterword where he talks about the theology of Jesus and the authority of Jesus, and that's the place for truth and healing. But I think what Amorth does, and Father Bamonte, the current president of the International Association of Exorcists, is to weave that through. So that's part of the substrate of the story, or the scaffolding of the story, is the priesthood, Jesus, his church, God, goodness, bringing evil to heal, and helping people get out of those problems, versus just telling a horror story and then saying, by the way, it was Jesus at the end. And so that's why, it sold a lot of books, but I don't think it was super helpful.
And I guess to kind of land in our the past couple decades, when we get into the 2000s into today, I mean, you talk to anybody who's in this space, and they'll say in terms of requests for assistance, people who think they might need help with somebody who to evaluate a situation, or even to the point of needing an exorcism, like, the requests are up. What's shifted in the past 20, 23 years on this scene? There seems to be a lot that's happened.
Well, I think it's mostly that there's been news stories about exorcism. There was a lot of news stories when the new Rite of Exorcism came out. There was the kid who seemed to do preternatural things in the hospital in front of staff over in, I think it was either Ohio, or was it the next state over? I don't remember. But that made national news. And then the fact that exorcists are giving interviews is a big change. And so people are basically aware, like, oh, the church is actually doing this. Now, what does that lead to? That leads to the bulk of the people, by the way, at least 8 out of 10 that call in thinking they have a demonic problem. It's either mental illness, a medical problem, or a misunderstanding. At least 8 out of 10. So you have a lot of suffering people that are legitimately looking for healing and a solution. They're suffering, they're having these strange experiences, and they say, well, it must be a demon. They just jump to that hypothesis. And so when they start seeing all this press coverage about exorcism, they say, well, that's what I need. That'll just That'll be the magic wand that'll take this problem away. And when it comes to mental illness, that just isn't the case. Exorcism is designed for possession. A lot of people self-diagnose as possessed when they're not actually possessed. So I think the number of requests is just that people are aware that it exists. And it was pretty much it was a hidden, quiet thing that was done in the rare cases of possession that the church found. And now it's kind of promoted and talked about. And so we're getting requests, not so much that there's more possessed people, just that people are aware that they can make the request.
And I guess one more place I want to go before we land. A podcast that was very popular this past year was the Exorcist Files with Carlos Martins, and he brings a lot of conversation around relics being used in exorcism, which isn't surprising because he oversees a lot of relics. I just for the person who's uninitiated in terms of reading much in this space, how would church relics be even useful as a part of an exorcism rite, so to speak?
The Cliff's Notes version, because it's a big topic. It kind of started in the ancient world, meaning, post Jesus, but perhaps even before. So within the Jewish world, there was an understanding just through experience that particularly holy rabbis, if troubled people were brought to their tombs and just kept there and prayed there, they would often be delivered. And this was just something that happened. And so people would, try it if somebody seemed to be troubled. And then Father Carlos knows the story better than I do, but essentially, kind of by accident, they discovered that the bodies of saints coming in contact with them spontaneously healed people of things that, like blindness, that weren't, it's not like being healed from a cold that I'm struggling with right now, but blindness, like it's a big deal. And so the church kind of stumbled on the fact that the bodies of saints seem to have the potential, it's not guaranteed, but the potential to have this kind of miraculous impact on healing. Now, in exorcisms, we not only use a lot of relics, though you don't have to, by the way, it's not required, it's not even in the book. So it's a non-issue in terms of the official thing. You can bring extras into it, holy stuff. You can bring extra holy things into it, but you don't have to. So why I find relics to be really helpful is if you're dealing with a spirit that, say, promotes a certain sin. So let's say a spirit that promotes, a bad kind of violation, ugly kind of violation. And as you're praying, you may pick up a relic of a saint who was steadfast in resisting that kind of violation to the point of being martyred. And so you're bringing to bear a saint whose virtue directly opposes the vice that spirit is built to do. Now, God didn't build that spirit to do that. Super quick. God built that spirit when it was a holy angel to promote a virtue. When it fell, it uses its ability in the reverse and it promotes the opposite of that particular virtue. So an angel that was created to promote chastity, when it falls, becomes a demon of lust, as an example. Okay. But God didn't intend or want them to be bad, but they had free will in that first moment of creation. So the relics are a great kind of adjunct or extra booster because, and let me fill in a little bit of the theology of it. A person, you and me, by definition from a Christian the theological and philosophical viewpoint, you are a soul and a body fused together, created together, and forming a unity. When you die, your body's here, your soul goes to heaven. Okay? Hopefully it goes to heaven. And it is now before God, standing before God in heaven, praising God and enjoying the beatific vision, right? Of being with God. The body is still part of your personhood. It doesn't cease to be part of your personhood. You're not using it at the moment. Your consciousness isn't there, but it is still part of you. It literally is part of you. It's part of what makes you up. And so when we go and pray, for instance, we all have an instinct about this. When you want to go talk to a deceased parent and you're really thinking about them a lot and they're heavy on your mind, you might go visit the cemetery and go up to their grave. You're standing next to their dead body. Why are you doing that, right? But we have this instinct that that's still part of their personhood. And so when we use a relic, we're essentially bringing part of a saint who's currently in heaven, and this in some mystical way is still connected with them as part of their personhood, into contact with the body that the spirit is in, that shouldn't be there. It's not its body. It's a disordered situation. And we're also asking that saint to pray. So it's not just that we're saying this body, this piece of this person is going to affect you. We're saying, Saint so-and-so, please pray for Bob here that we're praying for today. You're asking them to pray for you, not that you're worshiping them, but you're saying, hey, you're right before God. I'm not right before God. You've got God's ear. Would you add your prayers to what we're doing here, and pray for this person? And so saints and relics, from that perspective, are helpful and used by most exorcists.
And in terms of overall kind of reader's journey with the book, they spend the time, they get through all 125 pages. Is there a takeaway, a call to action? Like, what? How do you hope you've impacted each person who encounters this material?
Well, I hope somebody is a little educated on it enough to not dabble in it, as a layperson, because the paranormal world is moving towards promoting demonology, and they think exorcism is cool. They think that being scratched by demons is cool now in the TV shows, the paranormal TV shows. It's getting darker and darker. So I don't want people to misunderstand that exorcism is like a magical incantation where if you can find the book, you can do it. It's very dangerous. I'm trying to protect people from stumbling into that situation where you're just the regular citizen and the armed criminal and you're trying to do a citizen's arrest that we talked about earlier in our discussion. I also want them to understand and encourage them a little bit about their relationship with God, that ultimately all this topic is not important. The important thing is your conversion, meaning your journey with God and growing closer to God through your lifetime, which is what God wants, and focusing on the good. This is a topic about dealing with extraordinary bad problems, kind of like cutting a cancer out of somebody. It shouldn't be the focus of your spiritual life, right? The focus of your spiritual life, to take that medical analogy, is exercise, eat healthy, be joyful, get good rest, all those positive things. That's the journey of conversion towards physical healthiness. Exorcism is like learning how to cut a cancer out of somebody. It's ugly, smelly work. It shouldn't be the focus of your spiritual life. And so the thread that runs through it, hopefully, in the end is, yes, this is a specialized thing on the side, but the important thing is your journey with God.
Well, and I said this before you got to the interview. The book alone is worth it for the footnotes and the bibliography at the end. And it just, if you want to find some obscure books where you've read a lot in this space, like I have, I've encountered. I was like, all right, add that to my reading, add that to my reading list as well. I like what you said earlier in the interview, though, that in terms of this space of ministry, this is truly a space that you should be operating in if God calls you into this ministry, not something that this is not the area to fake it till you make it. Maybe that might be a kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of way to say it. Adam, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about what you do, where do we discover you on the web?
You can go to religious demonology, religiousdemonology.com. That's like an informational website for people where I try to have a lot of questions and answers and basic things like that. I do a radio show with a friend, Debbie Georgiani, called The Spirit World. It's broadcast globally on EWTN Network. It's produced by Guadalupe Radio Network in Texas. Some people have found that podcast, though we're live on the radio, it's also recorded as podcast. Some people have found that to be helpful because we get some interesting questions on the call-ins there.
Well, we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have a link to the website Adam mentioned. We'll also get a link to the podcast version of their radio show as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Adam Blai. Once again, our book today was The History of Exorcism. And Adam, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's always an honor and a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Shaun. God bless you, and God bless your listeners.